Lisa kind of clued you into what we're going to be reading today. We're sort of working through the Bible and like hitting all the greatest hits. This one you know well, and this is the parable of the Good Samaritan. We start in Luke chapter 10 at the 25th verse. Then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He responded, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. And then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" He said to him, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." Well, certainly some of the most powerful and profound moments I have ever witnessed in my life happen between people when one person meets another person who saved their life. You've maybe seen something like this on TV. Maybe you've seen it in real life. Somebody pulled out of a burning house goes to the firehouse to thank the firefighter who saved them from the flames, or the recipient of a life-saving organ donation meets the donor or the family of the donor whose decision to register as an organ donor saved their life. I have seen this in the hospital. I worked as a hospital chaplain for a while, and rarely, but it did happen, somebody would come back and thank the paramedics or the police officers or the doctors who took them from a very, very critical state into health and wholeness. And the emotions of the people involved in these moments almost defy their efforts to put words to these encounters, to express what they're feeling, what they're going through. Thank you just doesn't really do it. But if you think about it, we don't have much beyond thank you. We can add varies, thank you very, 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 very much. But how many varies is your life worth? The closest words to describe what's going on in these times is a simple admission that there just aren't words sometimes to convey the feeling of gratitude for somebody stepping into your life when it was going horribly wrong and giving you a happy ending. Our story today is one of those moments, one of the best known moments, I think, in all of literature. It's a story of a rescue, certainly, of a life saved. But in terms of a thank you, there aren't any of those. None at all. The rescued guy doesn't say anything. He probably can't. We don't know if he's in a state of consciousness or delirious or anything. But what we do know is he doesn't get one word to say in this story. The story explains why he's been beaten and left half dead. I always love that expression. Most people in that condition aren't very talkative, I have found. If he could have said anything, likely he would have told his rescuer to leave him alone, which is another odd little twist to this story. Why? Because most likely, we don't know for sure, but most likely this wounded guy, left for dead in a ditch, is Jewish. He's traveling from Jerusalem. Samaritans, for a lot of reasons, didn't spend a whole lot of time in Jerusalem. For them, it was not a holy city. It was not the locus of faithful worship. Their Jerusalem, so to speak, was on Mount Gerizim, but that's beside the point. I think he's Jewish, not so much from where he's coming, although that gives us a few clues, I think, but Jesus has something of a habit of telling stories that tend to poke a little fun at the presumption of moral superiority many Jews of the time felt toward anybody who wasn't Jewish. One of the best examples of this is found in the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus is approached by a Roman centurion. Now you can imagine, if you are a Jew and the Romans are your overlords, they have taken over your country and they're telling you how things are, you might imagine that Romans aren't generally seen as paragons of virtue or examples of anything that anybody else would want to follow. But Jesus picks a Roman centurion. This soldier tells Jesus his slave is sick at home and asks if Jesus would heal him, and Jesus agrees and asks to be taken to see the slave, which is a little weird because Jews of the first century would not even put a foot in a pagan's household. But Jesus says, yeah, I'll go with you. Show me to your house. But the centurion replies that, as a soldier, he knows that his commands will be followed. And so he tells Jesus, don't bother walking all the way to my house. Just give the word, and I know that my slave will recover. And then Luke says this. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at the centurion, and turning to the crowd that followed him, he said, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. You only need to imagine for a moment how that statement would have fallen on the ears of his audience. But this is what Jesus does. He likes doing this. He likes making a point that the people we suppose are on the outside are maybe a little closer to us than we thought. So all that to say, some of this is probably going on in the parable of the Good Samaritan, making it very likely that the guy in the ditch is Jewish. It would be a great story no matter who the people involved were, but it delivers, I think, a more significant punch if we're talking about a Samaritan saving a Jew, because it shatters a lot of deeply held prejudices getting in the way of people caring for one another. So we're going to assume, just for fun, that the guy is Jewish. This is a love story, then, between a Samaritan and a Jew. And you heard me right, a love story. It's a love story in the sense of Jesus' understanding of the word love, which is, by the way, a lot different than how we understand the word love most of the time. When Jesus is talking about love, he's talking merely, simply, perhaps most pointedly, about doing for your neighbor whatever your neighbor needs. That's love for Jesus. Doesn't sound very romantic, does it? Love for Jesus is noticing what your neighbor needs and then doing what you can to meet that need. So, if your neighbor is hungry, love is feeding them. If your neighbor is cold, love is helping them stay warm. If your neighbor is lonely, love is paying attention to them. And if your neighbor happens to be lying in a ditch, left for dead, well, love is what? Well, here's the punchline of the story. Love is doing exactly what the Samaritan did for the injured person that two respected others in Jewish society wouldn't. Now, it's probably worth being reminded that Jews and Samaritans as cultural groups don't care for one another. It wouldn't be unlike how a lot of Jews and Palestinians feel toward each other in the Middle East these days, except it's a little worse because Jews felt Samaritans had perverted the authentic worship of God, which is exactly what Samaritans thought the Jews had done. So you can see how that makes for tense relations. So as Jesus is telling this story, all the faithful Jews are expecting the Samaritan to be the villain. As soon as they hear this story, they want to hear what that, evil Samaritan did to that poor guy who's left half dead. Maybe he stopped only so long to find whatever the bandits left behind. Maybe he stopped just to kick a little dirt in his face and things like that. But no. All the revered Jewish religious types stroll right by. It's the Samaritan that stops and renders aid. It is the Samaritan who is the hero of this story. That's weird. It's not weird to us, but it was weird back in the first century. You bet it was. The Samaritan is the hero of Jesus' story simply because he's the only one who did what needed to be done. He's the only one who demonstrated mercy, as Jesus said. He's the only one who allowed love to defeat fear and prejudice. That's what makes the Samaritan good. He's the guy who didn't let anything get in the way of love. So throughout the Easter season, we're talking about biblical examples we can follow to share our Easter faith. And this idea of not letting stuff get in the way of love becomes a powerful way to help us do just that, to share our faith when we notice a couple things about this story. Thing number one, there is no difference for Jesus between serving people and loving them. Now, I know I've talked about this before, but it bears repeating. As far as Jesus is concerned, loving people and serving them are the same thing. Love and service are the same. When God looks down out of heaven onto us, and He wants to see how we're loving one another, He is looking at how we're behaving toward one another. Then thing number two, the love we're talking about is not love that we feel for our beloveds. It's not the love that we share in our families. That's love that we generate. No, this love comes from God. This kind of love, self-giving love, Good Samaritan love, serving love, is God's love working through us. Why are these two things important? They're important because if we don't move beyond our popular notion of love, then we will never get to the place where we can see our neighbors looking at them through the lens of God's love. Here's why. Popular notions about love, the kind of stuff we think about when we go to the movies to watch a love story, hold that it's personal and private and emotional and maybe whimsical and magical, and it's ours to give to whom we want. Right? That's romantic love. None of us are called to fall in love with everybody we see. That would be exhausting. Right? And so our notion of love, our popular notion of love, and I would argue our first idea about love, is that it's ours to give, to bestow on another person when we think they deserve it. Again, the kind of love Jesus is talking about is loving, serving, not when we think the other guy deserves it, but because Jesus thinks they deserve it and has called us to express that love to another human being. You might remember a few decades back, there was a popular slogan going around, WWJD, what would Jesus do? Did you ever wear one of those bracelets? Come on, admit it. Nobody? One in the back, thank you. Yeah. You know, for a time, you could get those in bags of corn chips. Did you know that? Here's how I know that. A guy in my internship congregation was the guy who made that happen. I'm pretty sure it made him fabulously rich peddling what would Jesus do, yellow armbands in corn chips. I mean, for a while you could not stay away from it. I mean, it was everywhere. It was on billboards and commercials in bags of corn chips. By the way, my favorite corn chips, Fritos. And, you know, it was there for a good reason. It was meant to focus social attention through a Christian viewpoint. All good. You could get armbands with WWJD. I think you could get stickers and stencils. I mean, you could get everything. It was a big deal for a little while. It really isn't anymore. And I wonder if that doesn't have something to do with it being a question. What would Jesus do? Question mark. Jesus didn't ask a whole lot of questions. He answered them. The Bible story we're looking at is one of those answers. And the answer isn't, what would Jesus do? Question mark. It's DWJD. It's a statement. Maybe even a command. Do what Jesus did. WWJD is a catchy slogan. Do what Jesus did, DWJD. Well, that's a way of life. We are called to do what Jesus did, to live like Jesus lived. We are not called first to hold the opinions that Jesus held, are we? What Jesus did, and the punchline to so many of the stories he told, isn't really more complicated than this. Meet people at their point of need, help people where they hurt. Sounds easy, doesn't it? So what keeps us from doing it? Because I think you and I can agree, this ain't happening everywhere. It's not a general rule of human existence. Well, I think it has something to do with the issues treated in the Bible. Fear, prejudice, how we are sort of given in our upbringing to believe certain things. But it's different in this story. A Samaritan turns out to be the hero. I don't think most of us think that we're very heroic. I mean, do we? I don't. I think most of us fear we won't have what it takes to come through in the clutch. I think we're prejudiced against our own abilities to make big differences in the lives of others. And I believe, ultimately, that all that is profoundly wrong. And I can prove it. I am going to break one of my sermon rules. And today, I'm going to name names. I'm going to share how some of the smallest gestures have made some of the biggest impacts on me and my family. And some of these gestures have come from you. I mean, not you personally. I'm going to name names, but I don't think they're here. You know, I'm not that much of a hero. When if when Kristen, kicks me out of the house, the first person I'm going to call is Bev Smith, and I'm going to ask her to make me a pie. If you've ever had a Bev Smith pie, you know that it has magic capabilities. Of course, me enjoying a slice of Bev's glorious baking won't get Kristen to take me back, but I will tell you this, it will make me feel better. Food can do that, can't it? Think about your favorite food, and I bet you'll remember the person who made it for you. We attach memories to food. Not to the food per se, but the human circumstances in which we received that food. I know this is probably just my imagination, but when I bite into an apple fritter, which is probably the worst possible thing you can get from a donut shop, my hand to God, I think I can feel my brain releasing endorphins. I can. Makes my head all warm and tingly. Nah, I'm just kidding. Bev is not the first person I would call. I probably call her number 3. But anyway, I'm not kidding about this gift of food. When my mom was sick with cancer, I took some time off to care for her toward the end. She was doing okay, but when she got close to dying, she really needed somebody to, take care of her 24/7. That was me. And I remember people from the church coming over all the time to bring food. The last meal my mom and I had together, before she went into the hospital, not to come back out, I'll remember it like it was yesterday. It was penne pasta with pesto sauce. How many of you have had pesto? Raise your hands. Oh, I thought spaghetti sauce was red and it had ground meat in it, and oftentimes it came out of a jar. I'd never seen green Italian sauce. What was this? It was so good. Oh, that's when I learned how much I love basil. But I had never, up to that point, seen or smelled anything so wonderful. And even before I realized that that was the last meal I'd ever have with my mom, I knew it was great. I still think it's great. And because that meal means so much to me, it has now become one of my family's favorites. I'm not even sure my kids know why we have it so often, but I do. Last summer, the woman from church who introduced me to pesto worshiped here at Trinity on her way back home through town. It's a woman I knew from being a little kid, a woman who helped raise me in my home church. And I told her how much that meal meant to me and how much it still means to me. And she didn't even remember what she had brought. But I will never forget what she brought. Her name is Carol Tuntland. And because of her, pesto to me will always, always taste like love. Well, I could go on and on and on and on about the things people have done that have touched me and lifted me up and healed me and put me back together. Monday, Thursday to Good Friday is my favorite dress-up day because I get to put on a scarlet stole, and then on Monday, Thursday, and the next day I turn it around and it's a black stole, and you've seen those. Beth Droege made those for Pastor Nick and me. And this is, of course, the first Lent without him, and putting that stole around my shoulders this year, I will tell you, felt a little different than it has before. And whenever I wear it, and I only get to wear it, 2, times a whole year, but whenever I wear it, I remember Nick and I going to the fabric store and arguing over what was scarlet and what wasn't. I'm still right. I got scarlet. He wanted magenta, not scarlet. But I remember the fun we had and the arguments we got into and the partnership that we enjoyed for 10 years. The stole, of course, is a sign of ordained ministry and symbolic of the work Pastor Nick and I did together. But it's also, to me, symbolic of the friendship and the partnership that Pastor Nick and I shared for a decade. And, of course, the formidable sewing talents of his lovely wife, Beth. And until I retire from the ministry, every time I put on that stole, I will think of Beth, and I will think of Nick, and I will think of the time we had together. It's just my birthday the other day, and I get all kinds of cards, and every single one of them touches me because almost always something is inscribed where the other person and I share something that speaks of our relationship. Jolene Marshall, who no longer worships here but considers herself still a member, will send me a card on my birthday, on my anniversary, for no apparent reason. When my dad was recovering from his breaking his hip last year, she sent him a get well card every week. Maybe some of you don't know how, or don't have to guess, what that does to the heart of the people who love somebody who's trying to get better. So I mention these things only to illustrate what the simple act of noticing what someone needs and meeting that need as best you can do. The power that it can unleash. I am here to tell you, it can be life-changing. And maybe you don't bake or sew with the best of them. Maybe you're not a really good note writer. But you can do something. You don't have to be what everybody else is. Be what you are. It's already enough. And it will become powerful when you exercise whatever that is to help a neighbor in need. It could be pulling the trash barrels to the curb for a sick neighbor, even when you don't like that well or talk too often. Maybe it's the neighbor whose dog yaps all day long. It's still powerful. Because that's what love does. That's what love looks like. Okay, there is the huggy, kissy, that's lovely, right? That is love. But that's not biblical love. Biblical love is muscly and active and on the move and scanning the horizon all the time, looking for opportunities to share the love of God. One of the biggest hurdles for sharing faith, I think, is that people really don't want something put over on them. It isn't good news if it's crammed down your throat. But what if it is offered freely and kindly and compassionately and helpfully? See, that's the power of service. Service is letting other people witness Jesus in you, not you pushing Jesus onto them. It is giving, not taking. It's joining with people, not judging them. It's paying attention to what your neighbor needs and then showing up to offer that. And if they should ask why it is you're doing these things for them, tell them the truth. Because this is the way Jesus wants us to care for one another. Well, that's what Jesus did anyway. It's what Jesus calls us to do for Him. It's what you can do for others, and it works. It absolutely works. I've been on the giving side of that more profoundly. I've been on the receiving side of that. And if you don't believe that, invite me over for a bowl of pesto, and we'll talk about it.